The air was heavy that night, the kind that clung to skin and slowed breath. The heat had settled low over the town, turning the parking lot into a sheet of black glass. Streetlights flickered in uneven rhythm, catching the edges of windshields and the silver curve of shopping carts left adrift. Malcolm Reeves crossed the asphalt carrying a brown paper bag in one hand, the other adjusting the strap of his work satchel. He moved with the fatigue of someone who had learned to measure every gesture. Behind him, the automatic doors of the grocery store closed with a soft mechanical sigh, shutting him out of fluorescent safety. The parking lot was nearly empty. A single moth circled the nearest lamp. Somewhere far off, a radio played through a cracked car window. Muffled, tinny, a love song turned to static. Malcolm's car sat at the far end, beneath a light that buzzed and dimmed in steady intervals. The vehicle was a modest gray sedan, a few years too old to look new but too well kept to be neglected. He unlocked it, opened the back door, and set the grocery bag inside. A child's drawing, stick figures beneath a crooked sun, slipped from the passenger seat to the ground. He bent to pick it up. The headlights bloomed before the sound of the engine reached him. A police cruiser eased into the lot, tires whispering against the asphalt. The light from its beams flattened everything, his car, the bag, his hands, into a scene without depth or mercy. Malcolm straightened slowly, the drawing still in his fingers. The cruiser stopped at an angle behind his car. Its doors stayed closed for a long moment, the hum of the engine filling the space like a held breath. Then the driver's side opened. Officer Hale stepped out. The uniform was immaculate, creases sharp, badge polished to a near mirror. He adjusted his belt as he approached, each motion deliberate, ritualistic. His face carried the blankness of habit, a professional vacancy that made his presence feel less human and more procedural. "Evening," Hale said. Malcolm nodded once. "Evening, officer. License and registration." The voice wasn't hostile. It was indifferent. Malcolm gestured toward the car. "It's inside." "I was just—" "Get it." The sound of insects filled the pause. Malcolm reached through the open door, careful, slow. The paper bag tipped over, spilling an apple that rolled toward Hale's boot and stopped there. The officer didn't move. Malcolm retrieved his wallet and held it out. The registration folded neatly between the cards. Hale didn't take it right away. His flashlight clicked on, its beam slicing through the dark, resting on Malcolm's face, then dropping to his hands. "Where are you coming from?" "Work." "Where's that?" "Distribution center. Off Route 9. Hale's flashlight hovered on the brown paper bag, then on the open car door. "You live around here?" Malcolm's mouth twitched. Not quite a smile, not quite defiance. Couple miles east, the air between them thickened, invisible but solid. The officer's hand rested on the lip of his holster, a gesture too casual to be innocent. Step back from the car. Malcolm did, hands on the hood. The metal was still warm from the day's heat. The smell of oil and dust rose around him. He felt the rough texture of the hood beneath his palms, the way the engine's faint vibration seemed to pulse through his skin. "What's this about?" he asked quietly. No answer. Hale's flashlight dropped to the ground, its beam spinning in slow circles, lighting pieces of the world one at a time. The apple by his boot, the child's drawing, the badge reflecting light in sharp bursts. "Keep your hands there," Hale said. Malcolm exhaled. The air carried the weight of resignation, not fear. He had lived long enough to understand the rules of this ritual. "Stay still. Keep your tone low. Let the moment pass." The officer moved behind him. The sound of leather, the creak of the belt, the soft clink of metal, a sequence of noises too familiar. Then came the shove. Sudden, precise. Malcolm's body hit the hood again. The flashlight rolled, its beam twisting across the asphalt like a searchlight gone mad. "I didn't do anything," Malcolm said, his voice cracking under the strain of disbelief more than pain. "Stop resisting." The words were mechanical, detached from reality. Each repetition made them less human, more procedural, the mantra of authority absolving itself. "Stop resisting." Another shove. The air filled with the hollow sound of contact, skin against metal, breath against silence. The crushed grocery bag split open, milk spilling slowly into the cracks of the pavement. The apple rolled further, its skin bruising where it struck the curb. The child's drawing, caught by a small wind, lifted and slid beneath the police cruiser's tire. When the struggle ended, it was not with a shout, but with stillness. The flashlight beam had stopped moving. Its light framed only fragments. A hand limp against the ground, the corner of the badge, the slow widening of a stain on asphalt. Hale stood over him, breathing heavily but without expression. He looked at the scene the way one might look at paperwork completed correctly. He touched his radio. "Dispatch, this is Unit 7. Suspect became aggressive. Requesting medical." His voice was calm, controlled. The reply crackled through static. Hale nodded once, though no one could see. He stepped back, the badge catching the harsh glow of his cruiser's headlights. It gleamed, sharp, perfect, unbothered, while everything around it sagged into silence. Somewhere beyond the parking lot, the sound of a siren began to rise. Malcolm's groceries lay scattered. Bread, eggs, a can of soup turned on its side. The spilled milk continued its slow migration toward the drain, white thread against black stone. Above it all, the streetlight flickered again, a moment of darkness, then light, then darkness again. By the time the ambulance arrived, the night had grown quiet enough that the hum of insects returned. The officers who gathered spoke in low tones, their posture straight, their faces neutral. One of them bent to pick up the paper bag, folded it neatly, and set it on the curb. No one noticed the drawing. Still pinned beneath the tire, a stick figure father holding the hand of a small child under a bright yellow sun. When the police report was written hours later, it was concise. Subject became non-compliant. Force was applied in accordance with standard procedure. No mention of the drawing. No mention of the milk or the light or the silence that followed. Only the system's language, polished, cold, perfectly intact, and outside, the sun prepared to rise over a town that would wake believing nothing extraordinary had happened at all. The hospital was a monument to cleanliness. White walls, white light, the scent of disinfectant stitched into every breath. The waiting room stretched long and rectangular, with rows of plastic chairs that looked as if they had been designed for endurance, not comfort. A television murmured the news in a corner, the screen washed in the same colorless light that coated the floor. Judge Althea Reeves sat beneath that light, hands folded neatly on her lap. Her posture was perfect, the same posture she carried in court, the same posture that told others her control was complete and unbroken. She had been sitting for almost an hour, or perhaps 2. Time moved differently in this place, as if it were filtered through the slow pulse of fluorescent tubes. A styrofoam cup of coffee sat beside her on the small table. The surface of the coffee had gone still, its heat long escaped. The smell was faint, bitter and sterile, like burned paper. The nurses had offered it to her in the same tone they offered everything. Gentle, efficient, rehearsed. She had thanked them, of course. That was her habit, civility as armor. Across the room, a clock ticked in sharp, mechanical intervals. The sound was too loud, a reminder that the world outside continued with perfect indifference. A door opened, spilling a wedge of brighter light into the waiting room. A nurse stepped out, her shoes squeaking faintly against the polished floor. She looked around before speaking, her expression already prepared. "Mrs. Reeves?" Althea stood. "Judge Reeves," she said softly, not as correction, but as reminder. The nurse hesitated, nodded once, then approached. "They're still working with your husband. The doctor will be out soon." The words were the same kind used for anyone. No difference in tone, no weight of recognition. Althea saw the faint tremor of discomfort in the nurse's eyes when she met hers, the instinctive unease people had when faced with a person whose grief refused to perform itself. "Thank you," Althea said. The nurse lingered, as if waiting for a question or an outburst. When neither came, she left. The door closed again, sealing Althea in the quiet hum of machines and muted news. She sat back down. Her judicial ID badge, clipped to her blazer, caught the overhead light. The glare flashed across the small plastic rectangle, turning her name into a brief flare before vanishing again. She noticed it and adjusted the badge so it lay flat. On the television, a commentator spoke about the economy, his voice smooth and certain. Althea watched the crawl of the captions at the bottom of the screen without seeing them. Her hands remained still, her breathing shallow but steady. Somewhere deeper in the hospital, a voice announced a code over the intercom, a string of numbers that meant something to the staff but nothing to her. The words dissolved into static. Her phone buzzed. She glanced down. It was a text from her sister. Heard what happened. "I'm coming." She typed back a single word. "No." Then placed the phone face down beside the coffee. Across the room, a janitor pushed a mop along the edge of the wall, his movements rhythmic, almost reverent. The faint scent of bleach followed him like a ghost. Each stroke of the mop erased some invisible trace, as if the hospital needed to purify not only its floors but its conscience. Althea's mind kept returning to one question, one she could not form aloud. How many steps does it take for a man to die from misunderstanding? She thought of Malcolm's habits, his careful tone when pulled over, his deliberate stillness. The way he taught their son to keep his hands visible when speaking to authority, a lifetime of precaution undone in minutes. A doctor finally appeared at the door. He carried a clipboard, though he did not look at it. His shoes were clean, his eyes tired in the way of men who had learned to compartmentalize tragedy. "Mrs. Judge Reeves," he corrected himself mid-sentence, recalling the nurse's note. "We've stabilized your husband. He sustained multiple contusions, a concussion, and internal bleeding. He's unconscious, but he's breathing on his own." Althea's eyes remained fixed on him. She said nothing. The doctor shifted his weight. "The police will want to speak with you soon. Standard procedure." "Of course," she replied. Her voice was even. He nodded, hesitated. "Would you like to see him?" "Yes." He led her through the hallways. The floor reflected the overhead lights so cleanly it felt like walking on mirrors. Every footstep was an intrusion into the silence. When they reached the room, Althea paused in the doorway. Malcolm lay beneath a thin white sheet. The rise and fall of his chest was barely perceptible. His face was swollen in places where the skin had purpled. His left hand rested on the bed rail, IV line tracing from his wrist upward like a thread of glass. The rhythmic beep of the heart monitor filled the space, measured, unfeeling. Althea stepped closer. Her hand hovered above his for a moment before she touched it. His skin was warm. Her eyes moved to the table beside the bed, a clipboard, a plastic cup of water, a folded hospital blanket. Everything was arranged with procedural neatness. No sign of the chaos that had delivered him here. She sat in the chair beside the bed, her back straight. The badge on her chest caught the low light again, gleaming faintly against the pale walls. For a long while she said nothing, then quietly, as though speaking to herself, "You always said it would never happen to you." The sound barely disturbed the air. Her gaze remained fixed on the monitor's green line, up, down, as steady as her breath. When the nurse came to check his vitals, Althea did not look away. The nurse murmured an apology for the wait. Althea gave no response, no acknowledgement. Her silence was not absence, but defiance, the refusal to make the staff comfortable in her grief. After the nurse left, Althea leaned back in her chair. The fluorescent light flickered once, casting the room in momentary shadow before returning to its full, sterile brightness. She looked down at her badge, then at Malcolm's still hand. Law, she thought. The word no longer held weight. It felt hollow, like a coin worn smooth by too many exchanges. In court, she had often told defendants that justice was not vengeance, that order required restraint. Now, in the antiseptic stillness of that room, those words sounded like mockery. The clock on the wall ticked again, a small, relentless sound. She folded her hands together. Her knuckles whitened, then relaxed. The untouched coffee still waited back in the waiting room, growing colder by the minute. In the hallway, a gurney passed, wheels squealing faintly, echoing through the corridors. Somewhere a door shut with the soft hydraulic sigh that hospitals reserved for the private end of things. Althea sat until the noise faded. Then she straightened her shoulders, smoothed her skirt, and spoke into the quiet. "He will wake," she said. It was not hope. It was command. Outside, dawn had begun to break, pale light filtering through the narrow hospital windows, washing everything in a shade between gray and mercy. And in that thin light, her badge caught one last glint before the sun rose fully, returning the world to its indifferent order. The press conference began at precisely 10 o'clock. The podium had been placed at the center of the police department's briefing room, polished to a sterile shine. Behind it hung 2 American flags, their fabric unmoving, their presence choreographed. Rows of folding chairs filled the space before the cameras arrived, each one identical, forming a grid of quiet anticipation. The air carried a faint chemical tang, a blend of coffee, cologne, and the ozone of camera lights. When the reporters filed in, the room changed temperature. The hum of conversation rose and fell in waves. Whispers of speculation, the clicks of pens, the shifting of camera tripods. At the back, a public information officer adjusted the microphone, tapping it twice before stepping aside. The tap echoed, then dissolved into silence. The chief entered. His uniform was immaculate, navy blue pressed with military precision. His badge glinted under the ceiling lights, and his expression bore the fixed calm of a man trained to outlast outrage. He placed a folder on the podium, opened it carefully, and looked out across the sea of faces. "Good morning." The word hung for a moment, absorbing the room's restless energy. "As you all know," he began, "an unfortunate incident occurred last night involving one of our officers and a local resident, Mr. Malcolm Reeves. We want to assure the public that this department is committed to full transparency and accountability." The script was perfect. The voice practiced, each syllable weighed and released with clinical neutrality. In his office across town, Judge Althea Reeves watched the live broadcast on a muted screen. Her office was a paneled box of order, framed degrees, shelves of legal texts, a desk cleared of everything but a laptop and a glass of water. Morning light fell through the blinds in thin parallel lines, carving shadows across her desk. The television's brightness reflected faintly in the window behind her. She could see both the chief's face and her own, overlapping images. The system reflected upon itself on the screen. The chief continued. "The officer involved has been placed on temporary administrative leave pending an internal investigation. Preliminary reports indicate that the officer followed department protocol in response to a perceived threat. We ask the public to withhold judgment until all facts are reviewed." He paused, not for effect, but for breath. Behind him, the flags did not move. A reporter raised a hand. "Chief, are there body camera recordings of the incident?" "Yes," he said. "The footage is currently under review." "Will the footage be released to the public?" "That decision will be made once the investigation is complete." The repetition of that phrase, under review, investigation, pending, filled the air like a sedative. It was the language of delay, the bureaucratic morphine that dulled outrage into fatigue. Another reporter asked, "Has the officer been identified?" The chief's jaw tightened, just slightly. "Not at this time." Althea leaned back in her chair, her hands folded loosely in her lap. Her face betrayed nothing, but her pulse beat steadily in her throat. The silence of her office amplified every small sound, the hum of the fluorescent fixture, the ticking of the wall clock, the muted buzz of traffic beyond the window. The chief's voice resumed. A steady drone. "We value the trust our community places in this department. Our officers put their lives on the line every day to keep our neighborhood safe. This was a tragic situation, and our thoughts are with Mr. Reeves and his family." At the word tragic, Althea's eyes flicked to the screen. It was not the word itself that struck her, but the way it was used, as if tragedy were weather, not consequence. The camera flashes punctuated the speech like small explosions of light. Each burst froze the chief's expression into still frames, calm, sincere, untouchable. Her reflection in the glass window stared back at her. A woman in tailored black, posture perfect, gaze unwavering. She thought of the courtroom's oath, to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. She had said it hundreds of times, required it of others. Yet here, on live television, truth was being dissected, rearranged, and buried beneath professional courtesy. The chief opened his folder, pretended to consult a page. It was empty. The gesture was theater, evidence of diligence without substance. "We are cooperating fully with external oversight," he said, eyes steady on the camera. "We urge the public to remain patient." The microphones, lined like black serpents across the podium, captured every word. Their red recording lights blinked in unison, dozens of tiny eyes watching, absorbing, transmitting. Althea turned the volume up just enough to hear the texture of his voice. It was smooth without tremor, a voice built to sound reasonable no matter the context. At the press table, a young reporter asked, "Chief, what was the initial reason for the stop?" The chief smiled, Brief, tight. A routine traffic check. The phrase landed with the weight of inevitability. Routine. The word itself was an absolution. Althea closed her eyes. In the dark behind her eyelids, she could still see the image of Malcolm's face as she had last seen it. Swollen, color-drained, a faint pulse beneath the skin of his temple. The machine beside him had beeped at regular intervals, each tone steady as the chief's voice now. The broadcast continued for 20 minutes. Questions repeated, answers recycled. When it ended, the chief folded his notes, stepped away from the podium, and disappeared through a side door. The reporters kept speaking after he was gone, but the microphones were already off. The feed cut to a commercial. Althea muted the television again. The silence that followed felt heavier than the noise had been. She rose from her chair and walked to the window. Outside, the city moved in its ordinary rhythm. Cars flowing through intersections, people walking briskly with coffee cups and phones. From her high floor, the world looked composed, almost peaceful. That distance was the illusion on which everything depended. She reached for the remote and turned the television off. The black screen reflected her face clearly now. No images, no distractions, just the outline of her own restraint. Her hand brushed the edge of her desk, where a small stack of case files lay waiting. She opened one at random. The first line read, "State versus Hale, not officer, not police department, just a man's name, sanitized by the legal process." She closed the file. On her desk, the microphone from her last public address sat unused, a sleek silver instrument of authority. Its mute light glowed faintly red. She traced a finger along its base, feeling the cold metal beneath her skin, a tool for speaking. A device that, with one switch, could turn silence into power. The line between the two had never felt thinner. Behind her, the blinds trembled as an air vent stirred the room. The light shifted, washing her reflection into fragments, half her face in brightness, half in shadow. Somewhere below, sirens wailed briefly and faded again. Swallowed by distance, Althea sat down, adjusted the microphone's angle, and stared at it as though measuring its weight. She did not turn it on. Not yet. Outside her window, the flag atop the courthouse rippled faintly in the morning breeze, not in defiance, but in endurance. And in that moment, as she sat in perfect stillness beneath the hum of her own fluorescent lights, the boundary between her silence and the systems began to blur, one reflecting the other until they became indistinguishable. The hearing room was colder than necessary. The air conditioning hummed without pause, indifferent to the discomfort it caused. Rows of hard-backed chairs faced a long oak table, its varnish gleaming beneath the unblinking fluorescent lights. The entire room had been designed to convey seriousness without warmth, justice rendered as architecture. Officer Daniel Hale sat at the far end of the table, his uniform freshly pressed, his boots polished to a mirror shine. The reflection of the overhead lights ran like a silver ribbon across the black leather. His posture was perfect, back straight, hands folded before him, the posture of someone coached to appear neither arrogant nor remorseful. Beside him sat his attorney, a man with a face too composed, his tie knotted in symmetrical precision. Across the table, 3 internal affairs officers occupied their seats like judges in a smaller, imitation court. They each had folders, pens, glasses of water untouched. Their expressions were neutral, studied neutrality, the practiced kind that hides disinterest behind the mask of procedure. At the back of the room, Judge Althea Reeves sat among the few observers permitted to attend. She wore no robe today, only a plain black suit. Her presence drew quiet attention. The room seemed to tilt slightly toward her, even when no one looked directly. She sat perfectly still, hands resting on her lap, fingers interlaced. From where she sat, she could see the entire tableau, Hale's gleaming boots, the rigid shoulders of the panel, the fluorescent lights washing color from every face. A court reporter adjusted her keyboard. The room settled into silence. The chair of the panel, a colonel with thinning hair, spoke first. "This hearing concerns Officer Daniel Hale, badge number 3471, regarding the use of force on June 17th involving Mr. Malcolm Reeves." The name, Reeves, broke the air like a quiet fracture. No one turned toward Althea. They didn't need to. Her presence was reminder enough that the man discussed in clinical terms had been her husband. The colonel continued, "Officer Hale, you've reviewed the internal findings? Yes, sir, Hale said. His tone was low, steady. And do you understand the nature of this proceeding? Yes, sir. Your counsel may make an opening statement. The attorney rose smoothly, buttoned his jacket, and began. His voice was measured, confident, the cadence of someone who had performed this ritual too many times to stumble. Ladies and gentlemen of the board, what happened that evening was a tragic misinterpretation of behavior. Officer Hale responded to a situation that, in the moment, presented reasonable fear. His actions were consistent with training and standard departmental protocol. He regrets the outcome, but we must remember that officers are often forced to make split-second decisions in volatile circumstances. The words landed softly, each one polished by repetition. Reasonable fear, standard procedure, split-second decisions. They filled the room with their professional sterility, forming a barrier through which no moral clarity could pass. Althea watched Hale's expression as his attorney spoke. It did not change. His eyes remained fixed forward, as if he too were observing from a distance. A participant in ritual, not reality. The attorney sat. The colonel nodded to the prosecutor, a young woman whose suit hung stiff on her shoulders. Her voice, when she spoke, was careful. Internal review confirms Mr. Reeves was unarmed, compliant, and verbally cooperative. Officer Hale's report describes perceived aggression. Could you clarify what specific behavior led to that perception? Hale's lawyer stood before his client could answer. Objection to characterization. The report speaks for itself, noted, said the colonel. Althea shifted slightly in her chair. The movement was small, but it felt seismic. The air conditioning droned on. The prosecutor tried again. Officer Hale, did Mr. Reeves at any point verbally threaten you? Hale's voice came slow, deliberate. No, ma'am. Did he make physical contact? No. So what prompted the use of force? Hale hesitated, just enough for the pause to matter. He turned suddenly. I believed he might be reaching for something. Did you see an object in his hand? No. The exchange ended there. The prosecutor looked at her notes, then at the panel. No one spoke. Silence filled the gaps where truth might have lived. One of the officers on the board leaned forward. Officer Hale, would you say you acted according to your training? Yes, sir. That's all. The chair nodded. Thank you. A faint scraping of pens against paper followed. Boxes checked. Lines drawn. Procedure fulfilled. Althea's gaze moved to the glass of water before Hale. It remained untouched. A small bubble clung to the side of the glass, trapped, suspended in stillness. Her own breathing was shallow. She could hear it, the faint rhythm matching the hum of the lights above. The colonel shuffled his papers. We'll adjourn for deliberation. Officer Hale, you may step outside. Hale rose. His boots gleamed as he walked past. When he reached the door, he hesitated just slightly, as if aware, though perhaps not fully conscious, of the weight of her presence behind him. He did not look back. When the door shut, Althea leaned forward, elbows on her knees. Her hands tightened together until her knuckles paled. Across the table, the panel whispered in low tones, a language of bureaucracy spoken softly, efficiently. Words like assessment, procedure, reasonable, policy drifted across the air like fine dust. No one said wrong or brutal or human. After 20 minutes, the door reopened. Hale returned composed. The colonel cleared his throat and began to read from the prepared statement, his voice as flat as the table before him. After careful review of all evidence and testimony, the panel finds that Officer Daniel Hale acted within the boundaries of departmental procedure. No further disciplinary action will be taken. The decision landed without sound. No one applauded. No one protested. The hearing ended in the same silence it had begun. Hale nodded, expression unaltered. The attorney shook hands with him quietly, their smiles thin but satisfied. From her seat at the back, Althea watched the exchange with the calm of stone. The light above flickered once, buzzing faintly before steadying. The air felt thinner, as if the room itself were exhaling. As people began to leave, she remained seated. Her hands, still resting on her lap, looked composed from afar. Only up close would someone have seen the tremor beneath the skin, the pulse that betrayed the discipline of her stillness. The panelists left, their footsteps echoing down the hall. The prosecutor gathered her papers slowly, avoiding Althea's eyes as she passed. When the room emptied, Althea rose. She walked to the table, paused where Hale had been seated, and looked down at the surface. A faint mark, a ring of condensation from his untouched water glass, remained on the wood. She placed her fingertips on it. The circle was cold. In that chill, she felt the outline of a truth the hearing had refused to name. That justice, in this room, was not blind but anesthetized. She withdrew her hand, straightened her shoulders, and walked out. In the corridor, the lights stretched in a perfect line, each identical to the next. Order without conscience. Her footsteps echoed softly on the polished floor. Behind her, the door closed with a quiet, deliberate click, and somewhere deep in the building, the hum of the air conditioning continued. Constant, precise, endless, like the breath of the system itself, alive and untouched by what it had just done. The courtroom was built to command silence. Its design demanded reverence. Tall ceilings, polished wood, light filtered through narrow windows that allowed only thin columns of day to fall across the benches. The air carried the faint scent of varnish and human tension. When the verdict was read, it came not as a revelation but as confirmation of what everyone already knew. Officer Daniel Hale is hereby cleared of all wrongdoing. The board finds his actions were consistent with departmental procedure. The words fell without echo, heavy yet hollow. A few murmurs rippled through the audience, the sound of restrained relief. One man, perhaps a fellow officer, exhaled audibly and clapped once before catching himself. The sound hung there, obscene in its singularity, before dissolving into the room's rigid quiet. Althea Reeves sat 3 rows from the front, her hands clasped in her lap. She did not blink. Her expression held the composure of marble, neither sorrow nor fury, only stillness so complete it became an accusation. The chief of police, seated a few rows ahead, nodded solemnly at the conclusion of the hearing. The reporter scribbled, the bailiff adjusted his cuffs, the machinery of civility resumed its rhythm. Every gesture was ritual, the system congratulating itself on endurance. When Hale turned to leave, the light caught his badge, and for a brief moment it gleamed like a mirror, the same reflection that had once blinded Malcolm Reeves in a parking lot under flickering streetlight. Althea stood only when the room had begun to empty. Her movements were deliberate, unhurried. The wooden floor creaked softly beneath her heels. No one spoke to her. No one dared. Her silence had become a perimeter. Outside the sun was low, pale, diffused, sinking behind the courthouse spire. She stepped into its fading warmth and walked to her car without looking back. The drive home was soundless. The city moved as if nothing monumental had occurred. Pedestrians crossing streets, lights changing, a bus exhaling at a stop. The ordinariness pressed against her like a weight. At home, the house greeted her with its own silence, the kind that comes not from peace, but from absence. She placed her bag on the counter, removed her blazer, and hung it on the same hook where Malcolm's jacket still hung, untouched since that night. Dust had settled along its shoulders. The living room remained as it had been, his reading glasses folded neatly on the end table, a half-finished crossword still on the armrest of his chair. The clock on the mantel ticked in small, precise movements, a sound too measured to feel alive. Althea crossed to the dining table. A manila envelope lay there, the official report. She had received it earlier that morning, but she had not opened it. Now she did. Inside, the verdict summary, the departmental seal embossed at the top. She read it aloud, her voice calm, almost detached. No violation of conduct, no evidence of malicious intent. Officer Hale acted within the boundaries of reasonable perception. She read it again, then again. Each repetition stripped the words of meaning until they became a sound, a dull vibration in the air. Her gaze fell to the bottom of the page, where signatures sprawled in dark ink. The names of men who would go home tonight, eat dinner, sleep soundly. Names that carried no trace of the life their decision had erased. She folded the paper once, neatly, and placed it on the table beside the envelope. Then she turned toward the chair, his chair, and sat down. The leather creaked softly beneath her weight. The cushion, molded to his body, did not welcome hers. On the small table beside it lay a few of his belongings, his wristwatch, his car keys, and the badge she had found among the items returned from the police. Not his badge, of course. The badge, the one taken from the scene as evidence and then quietly handed back to the department. She had requested a copy for review. They had obliged, unaware of her intent. The metal caught the faint light from the hallway. She reached out, tracing its edge with her fingertip. Cold, smooth, cleaned of everything it had touched. The clock ticked again. She sat in that chair for a long time, the verdict still whispering in her mind. Reasonable fear. Standard procedure, consistent with training. The vocabulary of absolution. Words designed not to illuminate, but to contain. The room around her began to dim. The last of the sunlight receded from the floorboards, giving way to the pale artificial glow of the single lamp still on. Its light fell unevenly, leaving half the room in shadow. Althea stood, crossed to the lamp, and turned it off. Darkness pooled across the room like water. From the kitchen, the refrigerator hummed. The clock continued to mark time. Tick, tick, tick. Precise, impartial. She returned to the chair. In the half-dark, her figure blended with the furniture. The edges of her form softened until she seemed to dissolve into the stillness. Her mind traced back through every moment of the past weeks. The parking lot, the hospital, the hearing, the verdict, each one polished by repetition into something sharp and clear. The system had spoken. It had declared itself innocent, as it always did. But beneath her composure, a quiet, precise machinery was beginning to turn. Her eyes adjusted to the dark. Across the room, the badge glinted once more before the light finally died from it. The ticking of the clock persisted, small and steady, the only movement left in the house. Time, impartial and obedient, continued its work, and Althea Reeves, sitting in her husband's chair, began hers. The courthouse was colder that morning, not by temperature but by design. The air held that antiseptic chill of bureaucracy, neutral, polished, impenetrable. The marble floor reflected the overhead lights with cruel precision, each reflection a repetition of control. The silence of the corridors was disciplined, not empty. It hummed with the latent energy of judgment. Judge Althea Reeves walked its length with measured steps. Her robe hung straight, uncreased. The click of her heels echoed evenly, every sound intentional. The clerks who passed her offered brief nods, unsure whether to look her in the eye. They knew, vaguely, the story of what had happened months ago. But they also knew the rules of institutions. Tragedy was to be acknowledged in whispers, never confronted directly. Inside her chambers, the badge lay on the desk. Locked behind glass now, catalogued as evidence. She had ordered it returned as part of an ethics inquiry. It rested beneath a label, Exhibit A. She looked at it for a long moment before sitting down. The past weeks had been deliberate. Filings, motions, cross-references. She had traced the pattern of misconduct like a map. Complaints that never reached review. Testimonies buried under procedure. One falsified report that linked Officer Daniel Hale to another non-compliant suspect years before. She had not raised her voice once during this process. She had used the language of the system, its precision, its restraint, its unfeeling syntax, and turned it inward. Every document bore her signature. Every move had been made in daylight. Nothing illegal, nothing impulsive, just the slow, grinding assertion of truth through the very gears that had once crushed it. By the time the case reached her docket, it no longer resembled vengeance. It resembled order. The courtroom filled quietly. Attorneys took their places. Journalists lined the back wall. The same fluorescent lights, the same flag, the same polished oak bench. Everything looked identical to the day the board cleared him. The symmetry was perfect, cruel. When the bailiff announced her entry, the room rose. She sat. The defendant stood. Officer Daniel Hale, now former officer pending review, wore a dark suit instead of a uniform. The absence of the badge on his chest left a blankness there, a pale rectangle of skin where metal used to gleam. His posture was rigid, defensive, a soldier without command. "Proceed," Althea said. Her voice was calm. It carried through the chamber without strain, the kind of authority that required no volume. The prosecutor began to speak, methodical, clinical, invoking precedent, policy, evidence. Every word was a blade honed by process. They presented internal memos, suppressed complaints, corroborating statements, from officers who had quietly resigned. Each revelation was followed by silence. Hale's attorney objected. Once, a weak protest about procedural fairness, but the objection withered beneath. The weight of the documents now projected on the courtroom screen. One complaint had described an incident strikingly similar to the Reeves case, language nearly identical to the one filed and discarded years earlier. Althea watched without motion. Her hands were folded atop the bench, her gaze fixed not on the defendant, but on the machinery unfolding below her, a system dismantling itself in slow confession. Hours passed. The room's air grew dense with exhaustion and something else, awareness. When the final witness left the stand, Althea spoke. "Officer Hale," she said, her tone measured, "you've built a career within a structure that taught you to believe that procedure was protection. That if your words fit the script, your actions would be absolved. Do you understand the nature of what this hearing represents?" He hesitated. "Yes, Your Honor." She nodded slightly. "Then understand this. What stands in judgment today is not simply your conduct. It is the architecture that allowed it to remain unseen." The courtroom was utterly still. Even the sound of the ventilation seemed to pause. She lifted the file before her, the accumulation of months, of nights spent reading until the words blurred. She opened to the final page. The evidence demonstrates a pattern of deliberate omission and falsified reporting. The defendant's conduct reflects a sustained disregard for the civil rights of those under his authority. The court recommends criminal proceedings. Her voice did not waver. Then she reached for the gavel. It was heavier than she remembered. The wood was smooth from use, the head darkened by years of impact. She held it poised for a moment, long enough for the entire room to feel the breath before release. The strike was sharp, clean. It echoed once, then again in memory. Not like a symbol, but like consequence made audible. The sound hung in the air long after her hand had fallen still. Hale's face did not change. The reporters began to write. The attorneys whispered to their aides. The machinery of justice, momentarily startled, began to move again. Althea set the gavel down gently, aligning it parallel with the edge of the bench. "Court is adjourned," she said. She stood. The room rose again. Outside, the light had shifted, a cold afternoon brightness that bleached the building's stone facade. She walked the same corridor she had entered hours before. The same portraits of past judges lined the walls, their expressions eternal in oil and shadow. At the end of the hall, she paused by the window. The city stretched below, orderly, indifferent, alive. Somewhere out there, people were returning home from work, buying groceries, waiting at traffic lights. The world had not changed. Not yet. She touched the glass, her reflection overlapping with the courthouse behind her. In that image, the badge, now locked away, tagged, and numbered, was invisible, but its echo remained. For a moment, she imagined Malcolm standing beside her, quiet, steady, watching the light fade across the buildings. She could almost hear his voice, low and certain. "You did what you had to." She closed her eyes. When she opened them again, the city remained, unbroken, unredeemed, but exposed. Justice, she knew, was not cleansing. It was confrontation. And in that moment, the silence, the same silence that had once marked her grief, became something else entirely. It became weapon. She turned away from the window, her robe whispering against the floor. Behind her, the gavel rested on the bench, its echo still faintly alive in the walls, the sound of a system finally hearing itself. Outside, the wind moved through the courthouse flags, their fabrics snapping once, sharply, like a held breath released, and for the first time since that night the air felt clean.